We're so pleased to also have in studio right now law scholar Garrett Epps. Garrett Epps is a law professor at the University of Baltimore. He's a legal correspondent for the Atlantic Wire. He is the author of Democracy Reborn, the 14th Amendment, and the Fight for Equal Rights in Post-Civil War America. Garrett was at an private event last night, also taught constitutional law for 16 years at the University of Oregon in Eugene. Garrett, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Carl. It's great to be here.
Well, look, let's start with Governor Rick Perry. This is a guy who says that Social Security and Medicare are unconstitutional, also wants to repeal the 16th and 17th Amendment. This is really part of a larger right-wing attempt which comes to mythology about the Constitution. It's spread by Glenn Beck and John Birchers and worked-up Tea Partiers. Rick Perry is really part of a much larger umbrella here, right?
I think that's right. There's a very well-financed movement to kind of do for our Constitution what the right has been able to do for evolution and global warming, and that is simply substitute their own narrative for the facts. I got interested in this topic when I went to Tea Party Constitution School back in October.
Where was that?
In Northern Virginia, in a church basement. And they explained to me they have a very glossy textbook, which is it's number 4 on the constitutional bestseller list at Amazon, that explains the Constitution was written by God on Mount Sinai, given to Moses.
The Constitution we're talking about.
The Constitution.
Here. Okay.
That it was taken by the 10 lost tribes of Israel from Israel to Britain, where they became the Anglo-Saxons, and then passed on to Thomas Jefferson, and that if government does anything that government didn't do in 5th century Anglo-Saxon England, it's unconstitutional. Now, this sounds nuts, and it is nuts, but they are spreading this, and people are believing it. And they are now in the process of convincing local school districts to adopt their books as official government textbooks.
Wow. These are like the the creationist theme parks. I've often said that the originalists, the original intent people with the Constitution are very similar to the fundamentalists of the Bible. But here you're telling me that they just break that whole line down if it existed anyway. This was given on Mount Sinai.
Exactly.
Wow. And this W. Cleon Skousen, is
yes.
that the author of this book you're
yes.
talking about?
The late Cleon Skousen, yes.
So where did he work from, and how did he get involved in
Clausen was very involved in certain kinds of Mormon extremism. He was also a former FBI special agent who later ended up as police chief in Salt Lake City. Kind of lost that job because he raided the mayor's basement poker game and put the mayor in handcuffs for gambling.
Sounds like a cheery guy.
Well, very involved with the far-right John Birch stuff.
Right.
And he blended some of this crazy religious view with the propaganda that was coming out of the South in the 1950s that was designed to destroy the Supreme Court's authority and preserve school segregation. And that far-right Southern white supremacist ideology is really the source of most of the things that people like Bachman and Rick Perry are spouting today.
Right, and I think I've read a number of articles recently that the Tea Party is disproportionately based in the Deep South.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's true.
Our guest is law scholar Garrett Epps, law professor at the University of Baltimore. Garrett, let's get to what the Constitution does say, and you make a great point in a story you wrote for The Nation in January, that we got to remember that the Constitution was written because the Articles of Confederation were too weak. It was written to give more specific power to Congress, for instance, to levy taxes, to raise armies, to make war, to set rules of commerce, to make international agreements. The conservatives would have you believe that the entire Constitution is to restrain the federal government.
Well, Congressman Paul, bless his heart, likes to say to people in these words, the Constitution was written explicitly for one purpose, to limit Congress. And this is 180 degrees wrong. If you study what was going on in America at that time and you study the comments made by the founders, beginning with George Washington, they were desperate to create a powerful Congress. George Washington had a toast at his dinner table at Mount Vernon from time to time when guests came, and he would raise his glass and say, "Gentlemen, competent powers to Congress," because he, having been general of the Revolutionary Army knew that Congress did not have the power to govern the United States.
Absolutely.
They were they weren't limiting a strong Congress. They were desperately trying to create and empower a weak Congress. One of the problems that people have is that they don't sit down and read the Constitution. I understand why that's true. It's only about 7,000 words, but it's tough going.
Everyone should read the Constitution. I've read it 3 times.
If you read it, you will see there is almost no language in it about what Congress can't do, and a great deal of language about what the states had better not do.
Right.
It was written to limit the states.
And they interpret by the way, when they wanted to read the Constitution at the beginning of the last House session and Senate session, they were rather they had a redacted reading, right?
Yes, they wanted
the Tea Parties.
Take away the historic parts that referred to the institution of slavery. And as we've seen from Congressman Bachmann, she wants to pretend that history really didn't happen.
Right. Or that the founders worked so tirelessly to end it.
Well, the reason that's important is that if you wipe out that history, you can also wipe out the most important amendments to the Constitution, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th.
That's right.
Those were designed to make major changes in a flawed system.
Right.
And they deny them. They're like Holocaust deniers.
Right. I'm going to get to can you stay another segment because I want to get to the 14th Amendment in the next segment. But very briefly before we break, this idea of original intent, the originalists of the constitutions, and Antonin Scalia is an originalist, right? Who sits on the Supreme Court.
So he says.
So he says. This is really conservatives saying, as you point out, that only they can decide what the Constitution says, right?
That's right. I think everyone who tries to interpret the Constitution is an originalist. It's a term that has no meaning. The question, because we want to interpret the document, for the purposes it was written and adopted. Mm-hmm. The question is, what counts as evidence? And I think mainstream scholars and progressive scholars say the major evidence of intent that we have, the one thing we know the framers did intend, was to write the words that are on the page.
Right.
And our job is to interpret them.
Right.
Well, the other side, beginning with Scalia, is what I call the Dan Brown constitutional school.
Da Vinci Code.
Right, the Da Vinci Code. They say, those words mean something else. And I looked them up last night in the big history book.
I will tell you. Yes. I'll be Moses.
And you trust me.
Right.
I always say Scalia's method is to say, listen, I know the Founding Fathers. I work with the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers are friends of mine. Trust me, I know what they would think. Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? So that's why it's so important to read the Constitution.
Right,
again.
For yourself. You write in this Nation piece, the most important truth about the Constitution is this. It was written as a set of rules by which living people could solve their own problems, not as a dead hand restricting their options. Let's pick up on that when we return about the 14th Amendment, because that's, and I want to bring up my friend Ken Cuccinelli, the Attorney General of Virginia. Right. You mentioned 13, 14, and 15. Let's get to that when we come back. Great. Garrett Epps with us, a great guest, a law professor at the University of Baltimore, and we're talking about right-wing myths about the Constitution. Rick Perry is, let's get back to the subject at hand, is a guy who is, and our guest is Garrett Epps, who's a law professor at the University of Baltimore. Garrett, thanks for staying.
Oh, my
Rick
pleasure.
Perry is among these, let's just say he sees the energy of the Tea Party in his right-wing Republican Party, and whether he's jumped on the bandwagon or is there in his heart to begin with, that's a moot point at this point. He's there. And he would be considered an originalist if he knew what the word meant with the Constitution, right?
Well, Perry is what we call a tenther. And this is the major part of his constitutional philosophy, is that there's some secret language in the 10th Amendment that prevents the federal government from actually maintaining a modern industrial country. And the 10th Amendment is one of the big right-wing constitutional myths.
Which says, tell our listeners that it
says
the power is not reserved to the federal government.
The power is not delegated to the federal government by this Constitution, nor denied it to the states, or reserved to the states, respectively, and to the people.
Right.
And those last three words are quite important.
Right.
the Tea Party and the Tenthers read that, and they genuinely insert a word. They say the powers not expressly given to the federal government are denied to the federal government, which is a genuine change. What they've done is substitute the wording from the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
And as early as 1820, Chief Justice Marshall said the word expressly is not in there, and powers. It does not say that a power has to be spelled out in words in the Constitution. The example I always use is that under the 10th Amendment, Tenther interpretation, the American flag is unconstitutional because there's no flag power in the Constitution, and so only states can have flags.
Right.
Well, nobody reads a Constitution that way, including the right wing when they want to use federal power for their purposes.
That's absolutely right. And we said earlier on this show that if you know your history, the Constitution supplanted the Articles of Confederation because the Articles of Confederation proved too weak. The word expressly is not in the 10th Amendment.
Yes.
Let's get to the 14th Amendment, which has been bandied about for a lot of reasons, a redefinition of citizenship. We were chatting off air about Ken Cuccinelli, who is the Attorney General of Virginia, kind of a right-wing guy, and claiming that gay people were not covered under the 14th Amendment, an equal protection clause or section, because they weren't around at the time or the framers didn't know about gay people. That has been tested in the Supreme Court, Romer versus Evans in Colorado. But get to this idea of the 14th Amendment as the Republican and right-wingers see it. Garrett.
Well, the 14th Amendment is the most important amendment of the 27. And that's not, my subjective opinion. It's was written as early as 1910, that all of constitutional law as it affects individual rights is a series of footnotes to the 14th Amendment. And among other things, the 14th Amendment is the first time the concept of human equality was expressly introduced into the Constitution in the Equal Protection Clause. The equal protection, now, what the right wing wants to do, and I've seen them do it. I saw Senator Pierce do this on CNN. They say, it doesn't mean anything because it only refers to black people.
Right.
And Glenn Beck is famous for saying, the 14th Amendment was written to deal with the problems of the freed slaves. Well, last time I checked, we don't have that problem anymore, so it doesn't apply. The 14th Amendment was written to do something much, much more important, and that was to require every American state to live by the rules of democracy. Human equality, the right to vote, equal laws, no unfair discrimination, and that is true whether it's racial, sexual, or any other purpose.
Equal protection means equal protection.
Equal protection.
That's right.
Human beings are to be treated equally unless there is some really overwhelming reason why they can't be.
Very briefly, we have a couple minutes left, but I want to get two questions in. One, tell me what you were telling me about Ken Cuccinelli, who really is as right as you can get. He's the Attorney General of Virginia. Tell us that story.
Well, I'm not sure he's running an Attorney General's office. I think it's a cult. And you can't talk to these guys. You can't argue with them. I wrote a column in which I printed in great detail what Cuccinelli's office said about a political question, constitutional question. And then I said, I disagree. This won't wash because I interpret this case, never mind what case, differently. Well, I got an email from, which is on my website if people want to see it. I got an email from Ken Cuccinelli's public affairs guy, whose job is supposed to be to make nice with the press. I had sent him a note saying, thank you so much for your help with this item. And the note said, you are a deliberate liar.
This is his press guy who's supposed to smooth it over.
This is the nice guy, right? Imagine what the frighteners are like.
What is your for time here, Garrett? What's your website? Just so we
go to theatlantic.com.
Theatlantic.com.
And then type my name in, and you'll get my author page that has all my columns, including the top 10 constitutional myths.
Okay, theatlantic.com. We're talking to law scholar Garrett Epps. Garrett, very quickly, we were talking about originalists. And the case that all of our listeners know very well is Citizens United. Give us an example before we conclude of how Antonin Scalia used his powers to discover what the founders meant in Citizens United?
Well, in Citizens United, the court held that corporations had exactly the same free speech rights as individuals. And Justice Stevens wrote a dissent in which he looked at the thought of the Founding Fathers at the time the Constitution was written, and he said these were people who profoundly distrusted corporations.
Right.
They didn't have a law allowing people to form corporations freely until much later. And he said, how in the world could they have intended for corporations to have these rights? And Scalia said, the dissent has some nonsense about the Founding Fathers. He says, maybe it's true they said those things about corporations, but that's just because back then corporations had monopoly privileges.
Oh, right.
Now, today, they don't, and the Founding Fathers would have liked them.
Yeah, so there he is, Mr. Interpretation,
Yes.
the originalist. It has to be seen through his eyes.
It's what I call voices in the head originalism.
Voices in the head.